welcome everybody to the 7th Scholars Talk of the Evo-Devo Universe community. We are incredibly honored to have another one of our newer members, Brendan, Gray, and Dempsey, and to take us through the evolution of meaning as a universal learning process. So Clement is going to be our host, illustrious host. So Clement, can I turn it over to you, sir?
Sure. So it's my pleasure to welcome Brendan Dempsey today. His background is in religious studies and classical civilizations from the University of Vermont, and he has a master's in religion and art from Yale University. Today he is a director of research at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory and managing editor of a new journal, which is called Integration, the Journal of Big Picture Theory and Practice. He has published a dozen of books theorizing development in culture after postmodernism, so that is metamodernism. And his research aims to bridge the divide between science and spirituality and to develop sustainable systems for life to flourish. All of this led through the paradigms of emergence and complexity which inform all of his work. And today he will present a synopsis of his 2024 book, which is called The Evolution of Meaning, a Universal Learning Process. Brendan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This is a real honor. I am really impressed by this community. I've been meaning to reach out and try to connect for some time now, and finally some things just came together, and I'm really delighted to be involved in the discussions that are happening here, and so the honor is very much mine. So yeah, as has been set up already, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about this Universal Learning Process book, but actually I'd like to really use that as a springboard to talk about the second volume and the implications of this approach. So I'll do some ground laying with getting into some of the basic ideas that I lay out in volume 1 of Universal Learning Process, and then I'd like to present some of the theory that I'm trying to get into in the kind of unfolding of these ideas, but also some of the research findings that are coming out of the Institute of Applied Meta Theory. So I do have slides, and I will share my screen in a second. I would ask if people don't mind just going on mute for the time being, so there isn't any background noise. That would be appreciated. And I am going to, so I don't usually use Google Meet, so let me know if this all comes through. I'm going to share my screen, and then let me know if everything is being seen with some kind of, actually, someone come off mute briefly if you can give me an auditory confirmation that you are seeing my slides here.
Yeah, I can see that.
Is it? Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, yeah, so the work that I'm putting out is sort of under the title of The Evolution of Meaning. I'll try to present for, I'll try to be mindful of the time. I'll aim for 45 minutes to 60 minutes, and I do want to keep a lot of time for questions because I'm actually really presenting this interested in your feedback, your ideas. I'll set this up and we'll have some good time for Q&A at the end. But yes, The Evolution of Meaning, that's the name of this sort of 10-volume work that I've got underway. And it's really aiming to explore the complexification of meaning, of significance, and of worldview, both at the individual and the collective levels. So let me talk a little bit about who I am and my background. As has been said a little bit, my background is in classical civilizations and religion. I'm really interested in particularly applying these complexity lenses to these questions. I'm the director of research at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory. And for those who might be wondering what meta theory is, I'm happy to say more about it in the Q&A, but briefly, it's an attempt to integrate various disciplines and various theoretical frameworks in a broader, more comprehensive and coherent framing. So taking theories from across the scholarly disciplines, but trying to apply a big picture frame that can integrate these into a more comprehensive whole is sort of the aim of meta theory. So rather than being limited to a particular discipline or scale or scope of research, we try to integrate the insights across many different fields. So I'm director of research there. I'm also director at Sky Meadow Institute, which is the picture there of that 115-acre center in Vermont, which I help run with my wife here, and doing some research also in that context, under the kind of guise of, like, I think our sort of motto is bringing systems thinking to the things that matter most. And so that really gets to the core of my research interests, which are applying complexity science and developmental and evolutionary models to thinking about religion and meaning making. My background being in the humanities and in studying culture and sort of classical civilizations, etc. So I'm really interested in these kinds of questions, and these are the things that excite me and are really at the heart of this evolution of meaning series that I'm putting out. And as you see there, too, at the bottom, the metatheoretical angle offers unique ways in which you can bridge across disciplines, from psychology to sociology to anthropology to big history to complexity science and so forth, to try to present, a very big picture understanding of this. I think that this elucidates a lot about the human condition and what it means to make meaning as a human. And so I find these lenses very, very powerful. So the outline for this talk is something like this. I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of meaning, what I mean by meaning, and give this sort of a meta-theoretical framing. I'll move into then how this relates to worldview and the kind of developing science of worldview at both the individual and collective levels. Then I'll get into a little bit of the research that we've been doing at the Institute that's been trying to measure these kinds of things and provide some quantitative analysis that we can actually bring to questions of cultural evolution and cultural complexification. And I'll end with some kind of broad comparisons that these help afford, and talk about some implications. And then obviously we'll set that up for question and answer, and happy to have a robust conversation and hear all of your thoughts on any of this. So let's start with then the meaning of meaning. What do I mean by meaning? So I'll, as I said, situate this in a kind of meta-theoretical context. This is a picture from the meta theory called the Unified Theory of Knowledge. It's the work of Greg Enriquez, professor of psychology at James Madison University. It's a really powerful model. What he's attempting to do in this meta theoretical model is, well, I guess the catalyst for it was trying to situate mind and mindedness in big history, in the big evolutionary understanding of where we came from. A lot of the existing models don't do a very good job with that, and there's a conspicuous absence usually of mind and mindedness that then leads to a lot of confusions around the nature of consciousness and these kinds of things. So the Unified Theory of Knowledge, or the UTOK model, provides a really elegant way of thinking about these major planes of complexity that have emerged across cosmic evolution. And these get defined as matter, life, mind, and culture, each one sort of arising out of the one before it. So this is a complexification process, and it's the story essentially of big history. And across this complexification process, these novel planes of complexity are theorized to emerge by novel information processing regimes, basically. So eventually matter comes to a complex state enough where it's able to process genetic information, and you get life, you get cells, you get multicellular life, and eventually animal bodies that are networked multicellular systems that are processing neuronal information. And with that kind of phase transition, you get the emergence of minded animals around the Cambrian explosion, 530 million years ago. And then from minded animals, eventually that develop symbolic information, which is to say specifically language and propositional linguistic mediation of concepts and ideas. And that gives rise to the culture plane of complexity, which is distinctly human on this planet, and the mode of processing symbolic or linguistic information in the way that we humans do seems unique to us. And so you get these four major planes of complexity emerging across cosmic evolution, processing different kinds of information. And basically, more simply, you could talk about the emergence of these different regimes, the sort of DNA, neurons, and words. I mean, that's what we really mean by symbolic information. And these layering on top of each other to generate increasing levels of complexity. Now, the reason why this is important for meaning is because it gets to an important kind of information. So what I do in my work is synthesize the work of Henriquez and his UTOC model with the work of Bobby Azarian, who's presented some really compelling ideas. I highly recommend this work, The Romance of Reality. Bobby's a science journalist and neuroscientist and a frequent contributor in spaces discussing complexity and systems thinking. But the major idea that he presents in this book is rooted in a notion of meaning, ultimately, which is to say adaptive information. So when you take a thermodynamic lens and you apply that to life in the same way that, say, Schrodinger did in What is Life, you get an appreciation that living beings are thermodynamic entities that need to maintain their sort of informational integrity by acquiring energy from their environment. And so that is aided. There's an exchange of information between the entity in its environment and a coupling of information between those two, and the relationship of the you could say the information that has a causal impact on that entity getting the energy it needs to maintain itself. That is adaptive information for that entity. And another word for that would be meaning. It's meaningful, intrinsically meaningful information to that entity. And Azarian's drawing on the work of Artemy Kolchinsky and David Wolper of Santa Fe Institute, in this paper specifically, which lays this idea out. One of the gaps, in information theory, as it had been kind of put forward by Claude Shannon and others, was that it didn't really account for meaningful information, right? So if I sent you 1 billion random numbers and you got them in an email, just according to sort of Shannon information theory, you'd received a lot of information, but it doesn't really mean anything to you, right? So how do we account for meaning in information theory? And that's what these scholars were able to add into the mix of appreciating what semantic or meaningful information actually means in terms of the relationship of a mutual coupling of information between entity and environment in a way that has a causal bearing on the viability of that entity. Information that allows for that, that has that kind of impact, that connects it with the energy to maintain itself, is intrinsically meaningful and valuable, and increases the viability of that entity, so informed, you could say. So that is very much the working definition of meaning that I'm using here to try to ground this in kind of a first principles approach. And I want to kind of keep this in mind because I really want to get your thoughts on this as well. A lot of you have, my background is the humanities. A lot of folks here with backgrounds in sciences, mathematics, and whatnot. So I'd love to be able to deepen our mutual understanding of this topic by being able to trade ideas around getting more into the insights you could bring to some of the deep mathematical and thermodynamic elements of this, which I find fascinating. But essentially, that's the dynamic of, and because you have entities in context that are processing meaningful information in this way, that processing is learning, essentially. That's what learning is. An entity learns by engaging in the environment and processing the information in ways that distinctly lead to its negentropy, so resisting the draw of entropy to dissolution, increase its chances of survival through being more adaptive, correcting errors in prediction models if you're dealing with sort of cognitive learning processes, particularly in like active inference sorts of ways. And just generally, learning is that which increases viability and flourishing. It's problem solving that has an adaptive component for the entity so informed. And so coming back to this meta-theoretical framing through the UTOC model, I'm interested in these different informational processing regimes, particularly as they relate to meaningful information, right? So in that whole scope of potential information, what's distinctly meaningful information that entities can process? And I guess maybe slightly before moving on, I will specify I'm interested in doing this kind of work because I think it allows us a way to understand the kinds of things I'm interested in from my humanities background, which is to say, human meaning making and religion and these kinds of ideas that emerge at the culture plane of complexity through deep, systems level ideas and first principles. So I'm really zooming in on the culture plane of complexity and using this deep understanding of meaning that arises out of sort of multiscalar, framings to understand what we're doing as people in a way that grounds that all the way down, in a sense, to thermodynamic necessity. So this leads to then some of the work that I've been doing to try to extend these ideas through increased, let's say, theoretical clarification, as well as operationalizing these insights and trying to quantify them, gain meaningful research data, and actually explore this empirically into the question of meaning making at the culture plane. One thing I'll say is that in a complexifying cosmos, moving from matter to life to mind to culture, each of those planes continues to complexify. And so there is already sort of implicit in that architecture the notion that culture is somehow complexifying, that culture is complexifying via symbolic information processing, which is to say meaningful information at the cultural level through language. Again, that's sort of implicit, but what does that actually mean and what does that look like? Could we measure that kind of complexification? That's really a lot of what I'm interested in, particularly as it pertains to human meaning-making systems at different levels. So looking at the individual and collective or cultural aspects of this, right? This is another aspect or chart that comes from the UTALK Unified Theory of Knowledge model. But what this is doing, it's a little busy, but I really just focus in on the red square there, is it situates sort of the individual within its sort of context of behavior. What is the entity and what is its context? And so across these complexifying levels, you're basically dealing at the matter level with objects and fields, at the life level with organisms in ecologies, animals and environments, and persons and societies, finally at the culture level. And this gives you a nice sort of break up of the notion of what the learning contexts are and what the entities are that are doing that learning and that meaningful information processing in that context. So again, different kinds of information processed in these different ways, and different learning, different kinds of learning going on at these different levels, occasioned by and afforded by these new ways of processing information. Now, this is a different meta-theoretical way to map this. This comes from sort of the integral model, which I've overlaid here the same UTALK complexity planes of matter, life, mind, and culture, so you can see those better. But it's more of a mandala presentation of this idea of increasing complexity over time. So the center of that circle is basically the Big Bang, and as you move out through the radiated sort of lines there, you're getting to increasing levels of complexity that are layering on top of each other and building off of each other. The nice thing about this model is it offers a way of sort of zooming in on the different aspects of this process. So the way this is divided up is on the left-hand side here, you have the interiors of things, which is to say, what's going on at the interior of an entity. So in this case, right, like the interior of an individual entity's might be its sort of conscious phenomenological state, that sort of thing. The other side is the exterior. So what are the sort of the correlates of that? Right? You could kind of think about that at the individual level, like what are the neural correlates of the conscious phenomenological experience of the interior? So interior, exterior, and then top is individual and bottom is collective. So you get a nice sort of quadrant approach to these different aspects of this complexifying process, which will be helpful for mapping some of the relationships that we're interested in exploring. So if we look at it this way, this top half is really kind of the frame of the individual learning entity, and the bottom half is essentially the learning context, the collective, and for the case of humans, the cultural context of that learning. And meaning, in this sense, is the relationship of the individual operating in its environment and processing that information, right? So the embeddedness of that individual in its context and how it's relating to the information, linking it to its environment, that's where the meaning making is happening at all of these different levels, if we take that idea seriously and follow it all the way back. So this now focusing on the cultural level specifically, just at the human plane, raises the question or raises the idea to begin to explore of meaning and worldview and how these are interacting. And I think they're doing important. We have to see these things together. Really a wonderful paper by Ann Taves and Egil Aspram, I want to say from 2018, proposing a programmatic proposal of worldview studies. And one of the things they do is they do a sort of review of the worldview literature, but they make some really meaningful distinctions that I think will be helpful for appreciating this kind of attempt to measure the complexification of meaning systems as worldviews. So a world in this context, they say, is basically the way that the individual organism constitutes a world in light of the environment that they're embedded in, that's practically relevant to that entity so informed. And so if you're familiar, for example, with the work of von Uexküll and ideas of like the Umwelt, you know, it's different organisms are going to construe their world relative to their biological apparatus that is a product of their own evolutionary niche. So the world that they're construing is one in which it's being mediated through, in a sense, the adaptive needs of that organism in context. And this is where the world model becomes important. For entities to be able to navigate their world adaptively, they need to have knowledge of that world, which is to say they need to be in some ways processing meaningful information about it. So you get entities with world models that are mapping what we mean by the world here. Now, a worldview is sort of an extension of this idea. And what they're basically saying is that this is the same thing that a worldview is getting at, but at the level of human being and of linguistic communication and propositional claims, which is really interesting because this is essentially the exact architecture you'd expect from kind of this U-talk framing, right? Of the move from even just mind into a culture. With the emergence of symbolic information processing, you can get ideas, you can get concepts, and then you have symbolic linguistic ideas that are able to navigate the same sets of concerns that organisms are dealing with, but now mediated through language with each other. And they make a distinction with Clement here, and wanting to specify that worldview, they're trying to reserve more to the human level because they want to see this as an explicit way that humans reflect on these kind of ontological existential questions about what is the case. So a worldview then is constituted by an ontology, like what is the case, what's real. And that's needed because if, you know, an entity needs to know what the world is that they're operating in if they're going to be evolutionarily successful. And epistemology is also required. So how do you have good knowledge about that world? And then because you're a situationally construed entity in an environment that has adaptive needs, evolutionary needs and goals, that implies an axiology, a sense of what is good and bad for that particular organism, in this case, a human being. And so that, of course, then also leads to implicitly a set of praxeologies, or what actions should we take? What is the ought here? If these are indeed our goal states. And I would put cosmology really as a subset of ontology, in the sense of it's a description of what is, but it's sort of a where did everything come from? Where are we going? What's sort of the broader context of everything that's going on here? And the point around all of this is that it's a way of appreciating worldview within this sort of meta-theoretical big picture framing of reality. So if world models show up, I think certainly at the neurological level, but one can make the case that there's a sort of world model even at sort of reflexive genetic kind of learning levels. It takes linguistic propositional content representationally mapping these kinds of things that would lead to the worldview construct that shows up at the level of symbolic information processing and meaning making that humans are engaged in. So one of the things that we're doing at the Institute is our own kind of worldview studies, literature review, to identify, you know, really the overlaps that are important here. Because when you do this kind of lit review, you see that as people have been probing the question of worldview, they hit on repeatedly some of these key ideas, particularly ontology, epistemology, axiology, and praxeology. And where there are differences, there are often ways that the differences themselves kind of fold in or slot into one of those kind of broader aspects. And this is to be expected if the world is such as it is in this kind of evolutionary complexifying way, that evolutionary entities are processing information for meaning across these different scales of needing to answer these big existential questions for their own viability. So that's kind of the framework that we're using, is looking at this through those core aspects. So with that kind of theoretical setup in mind, this gets us to sort of the research that we've been doing. and trying to probe this question empirically, right? So how do you then begin to measure the complexification of worldviews and meaning making? What does more complex meaning mean? What does that look like? How would, what kind of metrics would you begin to use for that? And this is some of the exciting stuff that we're doing at the Institute. One of the interesting avenues that we've been able to explore is using what's called the faith development model, which has increasingly been kind of becoming more synthesized itself with worldview studies. So this is a 2024 book on some of the most recent and important book to come out on faith development, which I'll describe in a second. They write that stages of faith, so-called, can be regarded as models of worldviews, and they build on the worldview studies literature to understand this particular model through the lens of worldview. Now, why faith? Well, faith is really another word for meaning in this particular model, and I'll explain what it allows us to do when we use this particular instrument to probe this question. So, a faith development interview was the product of primarily this guy, James Fowler, a theologian, who was working with the sort of developmental psychological tradition to understand the way that people's ideas of faith or meaning or purpose complexify across the lifespan. And so that is really what is meant by faith here. Obviously, this model has had a lot of uptake in religious studies context and developmental psychology context, but and certainly the word faith there does a lot of work. But faith, I want to stress, is being used in a very broad way that includes forms of atheism, agnosticism. It's really about the question of how an individual makes meaning, as it says here, a shared sense of meaning and purpose. And this can take any number of forms content-wise, but this was a structural attempt to understand the way that these things develop. So whether you're an atheist or a theist or a pantheist or any number of things specifically, that so much doesn't matter here. It's more the question, again, of like how an individual person's sense of meaning develops and to be able to assess that structurally. Now, what's cool then about this interview is that it probes some of these deep existential questions. Do you feel that your life has meaning at present? Do you think that human life has a purpose? These kinds of things. And so this is a tradition now that's about 50 years old, and there's a good amount of data and a number of interviews, which I'll talk about in a second, where we've now got a wealth of information about people answering these existential questions, getting at senses of meaning and value, which again, in the literature is recognizing is a way of understanding. It can be understood as worldview, essentially, and that this instrument is fundamentally getting at worldview. And I mentioned that this was an attempt to map these developments structurally. So Fowler was drawing on the Piagetian developmental tradition, looking at how people's ideas of ultimate reality and ultimate concern develop across different levels of sort of cognitive complexity, essentially. So that's a kind of stage model, and you kind of start out in kind of just sort of infancy with kind of very, very confused and sort of not even really coherent ideas at this age, in childhood, to what he called the intuitive projective faith, which is very fantastical. That's this early childhood generally. And then there's a progression from sort of more mythic and literal interpretations of, say, religious ideas and anthropomorphic ideas around, gods and deities and these kinds of stories that then sort of coalesces into what he called the synthetic conventional faith style, which is an approach to questions of existential concern that are basically conformist. You kind of you adopt whatever the view is of your kind of immediate context in your immediate community, and you kind of hold that particular. But it's not yet a reflective or an analytical approach to this. Still kind of deeply embedded, and conformist in nature. And it's not until stage 4, the individuative reflective faith style, where you start getting critical examination of held beliefs around the nature of reality and what's ultimately true, and the analytical method that then shows up there. And this leads to often a very kind of demythologizing move. Symbols are no longer interpreted literally, they're understood to be representative of ideas. Things take on a much more sort of cognitive and conceptual framing at this individuative reflective level of complexity. And the highest stages of this conjunctive faith is something beyond that, which is able to deal with different perspectives in a dialectical way. So the individuative reflective approach is very much about trying to develop a system of ideas related to ultimate concern and meaning, and that system has to be coherent and completely sort of formally logical, and everything kind of holds together. It's essentially the creation of an ideology and an explicit ideology. Whereas at the conjunctive stage, these ideas can engage multiple systems, and they can relate across different systems of ways of considering these existential questions, drawing from each, but also realizing that no one system is probably able to capture the full complexity of everything. And so this general faith development model, which you could call a meaning development model or a worldview development model in some ways, is moving through increasing degrees of cognitive complexity and taking on different structural forms. Again, content independent. And so an atheist or a theist or whoever can be operating these different stages, but it's about how people think about these things. Now, Fowler made a connection too, as he saw it, between individual models of human meaning making, like these different stages, and how these showed up historically, and made some links between suggesting that the synthetic conventional kind of represents a pre-Enlightenment or pre-modern approach. It's sort of emblematic of or representative of that style of thinking about these things. So a deep embeddedness in mythological systems, and not necessarily taking these ideas into the realm of rational scrutiny, etc. Whereas the individual reflective stage, he thinks is it corresponds to kind of Enlightenment style thought that it begins to emerge in the early modern period, and also makes the case that this so-called conjunctive or dialectical stage is reflective of a kind of postmodern turn. So you have sort of a pre-modern, modern, postmodern question around meaning-making styles and how they relate both to individuals and collectives here, which is a really intriguing move. And not the only he's not the only one to have made this move. When we take this sort of meta-theoretical map from the integral model, again, the upper there is the individual, the lower is the cultural collective. We see this idea of sort of mapping, these individual style meaning-making structures to historiogenetically, emergent collective or cultural meaning-making structures. And again, he's not the only one to do this. Very famously, Jürgen Habermas has argued for these kinds of ideas. Michael Horace Barnes has a great book, Stages of Thought, where he presents notions like this. It's a common move, I think, in the same way that sort of the obviousness of plate tectonics, right? When you see like, hey, South America actually seems to fit right in there with Africa in a continental way. Like, did they ever go together? There's both a sense in which it's an obvious yes, and yet for a long time, it's also been critiqued as an approach, because unless you have strong evidence that there is some really deep connection here between these different approaches, then it seems like a kind of speculative move at best. That what would be the deeper mechanisms driving collective, cultural, historical evolution of meaning-making structures along the same trajectory as individual ones. And so that is a big question that this research that we're doing is really trying to, again, empirically validate or falsify, depending on what the findings show. But the major idea here would be something like this: that cultural level meaning does evolve through symbolic learning, through individuals and contexts, towards increasing degrees of complexity. And the question again is sort of, all right, well, if that's potentially the case, how could you measure it, and what does that look like? So that's the research that we're doing. And I'll unpack this a little bit and show you what our findings have been. Fowler was working with the Piagetian model, which was kind of the gold standard of developmental psychological models until around the 80s, when it was sort of superseded by neo-Piagetian ways of thinking about these same questions. So Piaget kind of really outlines the core major stage structures, arguably, during this period of how the mind complexifies and how human learning looks. But after 1980, you get the emergence of a construct called hierarchical complexity, which improves on Piaget's model, refines it, clarifies some misunderstandings and these sorts of things. and also makes it more precise. So for, Piaget's 4 or 5, if you count post-formal stages, you actually get orders of hierarchical complexity that are mapping the same dimension, but doing it with much greater granularity and precision, and also being able to, again, sort of formalize these stages in a more robust way. This has really been, I think, I don't want to say perfected, but certainly improved and taken to a new peak of rigor and precision by the work of Dr. Theo Linda Dawson, who's developed something called the lectical scale, which is a very fine-tuned way of being able to get at the way human minds cognitively complexify in a neo-Piagetian way. And this is actually very important around the methodology here of how this is done, that I briefly want to touch on, because it's important for this notion around looking at cultural complexification as a matter of symbolic information processing that's leading to greater degrees of complexity. Basically, the way this works is that these different orders of complexity can be let's say, used as indexical ways to map particular vocabulary or semantic units, so that, for example, a simple representation of, there it is, so the word is, right? It will just be at sort of stage 6 or level 6, single representations. But a single abstraction, something like harmful or mortal, is a more complex idea, and that's at level 9, all the way up to systems of abstractions, the terms that would require that level of cognitive complexity, so things like recursive and iterative and systemic, cyclic, ideas that by themselves convey a kind of a systematic nature for them to be useful and functional. So if you basically develop a very expansive dictionary of meanings, of linguistic meanings that are indexed to particular complexity levels, and actually in this case, portions of complexity levels, you can get a very fine-tuned way of measuring the way that people use language and the distributions of different levels of complexity in their language across those performances. So that's basically what lexical scoring does, using a dictionary of like 40,000 or so semantic units that have been kind of painstakingly developed over the past 30 years by Dr. Dawson and her team. You can do an automated assessment of a written text, and you can actually begin to see the curve, the distributional curve of different levels of complexity in a performance, and then you can use this to basically identify the level of hierarchical complexity that you could score that text at. So it's an operationalization of the core insight of Piaget and the Piagetians, and later the neo-Piagetians, in a really, really important way, through the complexification, using the idea that language has a kind of complexification axis that you can measure. And you can see why this would be important for the questions that we're asking. But this is a little map to give you an example of as you increase in hierarchical complexity, what you're really seeing is the sedimentation of increasing levels of complexity of ideas that are sort of building off of each other. So this is developmental fundamentally, because new ideas emerge by building off of earlier ideas, new levels of abstraction emerge out of more representational or concrete ideas. And as you measure this, you start to see increasing percentages of that kind of high-level, abstract, complex language showing up in performances. And you can use that as a measure then for the complexity of a text. So that brings us to the question of this research of our research program in terms of what would be the approach that we could take to empirically try to explore this question of cultural complexification through meaningful symbolic information processing. And the first step would be to measure individual meaning systems using this kind of hierarchical complexity analysis. And so basically that would be, and that is what we're doing. We're looking at the faith development model by measuring performances in terms of their hierarchical complexity. Now, again, the reason why I think this model is really helpful is because there are thousands and thousands of faith development interviews that have been done. We are working with a data set of around 500 of them. So there's a lot of data basically there for us to mine in this way to use these existing data sets over the past 30 years that we can actually have a measure for the complexity of hundreds of different faith development interviews, and then see what the content is and see how that maps to different meaning systems. And then the next step would be to measure collective meaning-making systems using the same metric if we're going to make any kind of comparisons potentially between the two. So here we'd be looking at the context. And for this, we're doing a project what's called the Cultural Complexity Index, which is essentially, again, applying the same scale, but this time not to faith development interviews, but actually to the canons of meaningful literature across these different historical epochs. You know, if you're able essentially to measure the complexity of a text, then what do you find when you measure texts of the Bible? Or texts of the Rig Veda, very meaningful, obviously text for people and really core to meaning systems, cultural collective meaning systems that emerge out of, you know, kind of a pre-modern context. But similarly from the modern context, you know, how do the complexity levels relate if you're looking at Descartes or I don't know, Hume or Newton on into postmodern thought? Is there a complexity increase when you get to the postmodern thinkers and the work of, say, I don't know, like Thomas Kuhn or Rorty or these folks or Foucault. But this is the project that we are engaging in with this Cultural Complexity Index project. And what we're doing is essentially compiling a massive database of these texts and then scoring them. They are partitioned into specific kind of bins, forager, archaic, axial, modern, postmodern, and integrative, which we believe are broadly representative potentially of these sort of different meaning-making structures or systems that have emerged across cultural evolution. And at this point in the process, we've done a good amount of scoring of forager texts, archaic texts, and some integrative and postmodern ones. And so I'll be getting to that in a second. Still outstanding are the axial and modern texts, but just to give you a sense of what we're up to, and then to consider, you know, what this leads to. And so if you measure individual meaning-making systems at, say, these different levels of faith structuration or worldview / meaning levels of complexity, and you also study historical cultural meaning systems as represented by canonical texts that are, yeah, again, sort of ideal types in the sense, well, and that's not really the right way to put it, but that are representative of these different historical epochs. You know, what happens when you compare the two findings. So now I'll get into the actual data that we've been generating through this project, and we'll explore the findings. So individual meaning systems, when we've done this with an early study of 38 faith development interviews, this was the finding that we got in terms of the different faith structures or meaning structures and how they related to levels of complexity. You can see an obvious increase sort of from the lower stages to the higher stages, and you begin to see the specific sort of profiles that these different styles of meaning making might exhibit in terms of their complexity. So remember, stage 3 was that synthetic conventional. It was very sort of conformist. It sort of you know, adopted sort of whatever the dominant mythological or ideological system is that people are around. Doesn't really give much energy or effort towards rational thought or kind of analysis of these structures. Well, these tend to cluster, you know, in the middle of like a level 10, electrical level 10, and somewhere between, you know, the early thousands and 3.5s can go up, you know, a little around 1100. Stage 4s, you start to see an increase in complexity, breaking into level 11 in abstract systems. And stage 5s, there's not as many of them, but also, you know, in an increasing degree of complexity. And so that was an initial finding that started to give us some of the basic profiles of these different meaning-making structures. I'm just throwing some distribution chart analysis at you, but it's not that important for this context. Doing some more analysis like this with a larger data set that also included the earlier stages and a few additional stages or a few additional interviews. We got a very kind of clear curve here that different meaning-making structures that have been identified through this faith or worldview development model do indeed exhibit an arc of increasing complexity as measured by lectical score. When we then, you could say, blew this open even further and brought in a bunch of other models that we could study in similar terms. For example, Robert Keegan's model of the nature of sort of self-construction, Cheryl Arman and her model of value, Lawrence Kohlberg and his famous morality stage model. And we did similar analyses on the interview data. We got this. And so again, a kind of clear trajectory, a clear complexification arc in terms of the crucial ways that human beings make meaning as kind of measured by these stage models in developmental psychology. And the beginning again of establishing certain complexity profiles for these kinds of meaning making. So we see stage 3 kind of hovers around, 1000, which is to say, level 10. And then stage 4 starting to hover around level 11 or the 1100, and stage 5's moving beyond that. It gives a clear axis of complexity to all this. Now, mapping all these together, again, you can kind of get a sense of, all right, these are sort of the rough ways that complexity shows up in these different, we kind of map these all together. And when we try to overlay this with some degree of, what would you say, we're looking for the continuities across these different approaches here, where we see that all of them are clustering in sort of these same areas. And what are these specific complexity profiles? We can use a kind of color scheme to kind of designate what these are. So that kind of stage 2 mythic literal kinds of meaning making structures we can call red. We can put that in that sort of color, that band of the color spectrum. And it's somewhere between 925 or 950 and 1000. Moving into like an amber structure would be something, anyway, you can see the rest of the numbers here. But this allows us to, again, get a sense of what these ranges are and what these profiles are for these different kinds of meaning-making structures and how they actually can be shown to complexify in a particular way. So taking the same approach, but now looking at the cultural data, what do we see? So for this, we measured a number of things. We looked at, I'm getting some background noise. If someone wouldn't mind going on mute, I'd be much appreciated. Thanks. So what did we do here? We looked at oral tales by hunter-gatherer societies. We looked at sections of the early Bible. We looked at Egyptian and Mesopotamian literature. We looked at the Iliad and the Odyssey, etc. And we looked at more recent, the bins that we would describe as postmodern and integrative. Again, we haven't yet done the axial and the modern bins yet. So what we see here is that there are meaningful trends in this kind of development, and that when we overlay those kinds of profile maps, we see a kind of interesting way in which we might be able to relate collective meaning-making systems to individual kinds of systems. Now, this will become clear if you actually directly overlay, the faith development or worldview development levels onto the same data, and you can start to see where these kinds of things cluster together. And so, again, when you're looking at the kinds of material of sort of like, the patriarchal narratives, for example, in the early biblical accounts, where Abraham or Moses are going around, and those kinds of folk legends from the ancient Israelite tradition, they are scoring in the same mythic literal level that individuals at that complexity level who operate from a kind of mythic literal perspective too. And in terms of the kind of later Egyptian literature and the material that emerges actually out of a more scribal bureaucratic milieu, you see the rise into early formal operational thinking, which in this case is sort of the synthetic conventional, and that those cluster in a meaningful way. And similarly, actually the very high scoring things have similar correspondences. Now, if you look at this temporally and you lay this out on a timeline, this is basically the data that we're looking at. So the forager data is sort of, which is actually from 20th century anthropological literature. But if we use that as a stand-in for something like, the Neolithic, we'll put that at the beginning, and then everything else is actually specific to the year. It's chronologically accurate in that sense. So we see this clustering here in these different bands, where the sort of, if you want to say, the Neolithic hunter-gatherer meaning-making systems follow a complexification trend that leads into early agrarian societies that eventually see the rise of bureaucratic states and temple complexes and the rise of literacy and that sort of thing. And then those seem to cluster in that synthetic conventional area. After the Bronze Age collapse, actually, is when we get the early Israelite literature, and you can see that kind of dip potentially of that decomplexification potentially manifested in that chunk of scores that you see in the red block there. And again, missing the axial and the modern scores for the time being, which we're about to fill in. We do, though, have the kind of postmodern and integrative, which you see way on the other end of the screen there. And those are in a kind of conjunctive level, you could say. Now, if you overlay this finally, and we're beginning to wrap up, so I appreciate your patience. But this is really interesting. I think it's an important angle that we're interested in. If you overlay these kinds of trends with basically energy input, you also can find some meaningful insights here. So if you're familiar with the work of Ian Morris, he has a great work called Foragers, Farmers, and Fossil Fuels, How Human Values Evolve, and is basically exploring the way that meaning systems and their associated values, or axiology, you could say, evolve relative to the amount of caloric intake per person per day. If you map those measures, you can actually see the meaning systems and the value systems change at certain thresholds, basically, and as particular social organizational systems kind of come online to more adequately harness energy. Those kinds of systemic shakeups lead to reorganizations of value structures and meaning-making systems, and you can begin to actually quantifiably assess those kinds of things. So if we overlay some of that data on these kinds of complexity trends that we're seeing from the meaning structures of the ideas themselves, it's very interesting. So if you look at the sort of Neolithic, and consider that that's averaging, let's say, around 5,000 kcal a day per person. By the time you get to the agrarian civilizations, you're able to, leverage around 25,000 kcal per day. And there's there is an actual rise in, you could say, cognitive complexity in terms of at least the kind of scribal elites of the day and what they're doing. Fast forward to basically the postmodern, or let's say the modern and the postmodern, and you see this exponential increase of energy consumption and also a complexification of cognitive structures. And so one of the interesting ideas here is the potential of understanding historiogenetic cultural cognitive complexification in terms of a kind of dissipative structure. If you think about adding more energy, or if you want to think about free energy rate density coming into a system and reorganizing that system in particular ways, specifically in ways that complexify it, then that's an interesting way of thinking about what's going on in sort of broad scale cultural evolution as humanity has been able to harness more energy. It's complexified in all sorts of ways, but one key way that seems to be correlated with that is the cognitive complexification and the way that that complexity is used to process symbolic information for meaning. So as meaning develops and evolves and complexifies, there is an underlying sort of energetic throughput that is sort of allowing, for example, for the construction of mass education in the modern period, a massive, energy requirement, but necessary if you're going to see a new kind of cognitive default level emerge in modern society. So these are sort of the beginning thoughts and efforts that we're engaged in, trying to think about meaning-making systems along lines of complexity, appreciating spectra that we can use to see complexity profiles for different meaning-making systems at individual and collective levels. And it's really just the beginning. If you're interested in this stuff, check us out at the Institute of Applied Meta-Theory. We just did launch this Worldview Studies initiative. We're drawing a lot on Clement's work and find that deeply valuable, and all the kinds of connections he makes. But I'll leave it there. That's kind of the introduction. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Hopefully you found this interesting, and I would love to get your thoughts, critiques, perspectives on all of this. So yeah, let's open this up for some Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was such a rich presentation. Thank you very much. So, okay, so if you can just raise your hand, either with the video or with the button on Google Meet, then I can take questions. Yes, Jim, go ahead.
Brendan, that's fascinating. Thank you for that. I mean, I have so many questions, and I don't know if I'm how to prioritize them. But let me just start with this idea of complexity, which is kind of a through line through your talk, and your quantification of complexity, and that you know, one of the things, and I've been posting about this. I'm a student of Robert Rosen, and I keep going back to Robert Rosen. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. But so he was a mathematical biologist, and he wrote a lot about complexity, but he had a somewhat idiosyncratic definition of complexity. So your definition, I think, you know, is probably the more common idea, which it's measurable because complexity can be related to basically the number of different things. So when we talk about the complexity of an animal, you can measure that in terms of the number of cell types, for example, and humans have the most cell types of any animal. So that's one way of thinking about complexity. Rosen's way of thinking about complexity was in terms of categories. So category theory in mathematics was his thing, and so complexity for Rosen was a category, and it's more binary. So a system is either complex or it's simple. And he distinguished, and he had a way of distinguishing between a complex system and a simple system. And simple systems are things that you can basically model as machines and that are Turing computable. Whereas complex systems you cannot model as a machine. They are not reducible to being a machine, and they're not Turing computable. So that's a little bit different measure of complexity. But the reason I'm bringing it up is there's different ways of looking at the world and having a world view. And one way is that the world is something that exists outside of us that we can understand, and we're going to get a better and better understanding of. But another way of looking at it, which is a physicist who I posted a paper about that I just found out about yesterday, is that's a false way of looking at reality, that everything is relational. So everything we understand about the world is in relation to is a relationship between us and what we're trying to understand. And that's what Rosen is also getting at with his model and complexity. Everything is relational. So everything you're talking about is a relation between human understanding of the world, and all this complexification is the complexification in our human understanding. But then, I mean, as you've self had said in what you've written about, all animals have a relation to the world, and they're learning about the world, but they're doing it in different ways. And this relates to a book that came out a couple years ago, An Immense World by Ed Young. He talks about how all the different ways that different animals actually relate to the world through their sensory systems. So I don't know what my question is, but maybe you can just comment on these. You know, everything. There's a duality here. One is that there is a world that we can relate to, and we can all try and understand, and our models will get better and better. But there's another one, which is that every time in relating to the world, we're getting at some aspect, but that it's never going to be comprehensive.
Yeah, totally. No, that's very. I would take a version of that view myself. I would say a couple of things. So yeah, I think I hit on it a little bit, but I think a good bit more about it in the first volume, around the Umwelt idea and around the fundamentally embodied and embedded and sort of contextual nature of whatever world model is being sort of developed. Right. So a bat, this gets to like, Thomas Nagel's work around, what's it like to be a bat? So a bat, it uses sonar and all these things. And so for me to try to imagine what's it like to be a bat, I really cannot do that. I would be imagining how I might be as a bat, because I'm using the instrument of my cognitive apparatus that's evolved in my particular way along my particular evolutionary arc as a human being to try to then step into what it's like to be a bat. But I can't really do that. And so there is in a sense, a kind of incommensurability at certain junctures if you try to appreciate a different kind of world model, because it's being modeled so radically different through different sensory inputs, through different sort of physiological structures, out of the need for that entity to map its relationship to its world, right? And so the Umwelt idea, I think, captures that really well, that the world is always deeply contextual in that way. And it's a process of the relationship between the two. Cognitive scientist John Vervaeke uses the word transjective to talk about something that's not subjective or objective, but it's the relationship of the two to each other in an important way. And I see meaning and meaning making and world modeling and world views as transjective. They are mapping a particular individual to a particular environment. And so there are ways you can go radically into that view, and I think it leads to certain kinds of more kind of postmodern social constructivism and a kind of radical relativism in the sense of like, oh, the radical incommensurability of perspectives. I don't take that view, because while I think things and beings are situated, there is a world, and so we are mapping something. And even if we're mapping it differently, we're mapping it differently in the way that relationships can be mapped one to the other. There's questions around whether a given phenomenology could ever experience another kind of, Umwelt's phenomenology. But in terms of like the reality of the world out there that we are somehow relating to, I think you need that, because if you don't have something that's out there that resists, then you don't have any need or ability to learn, because you need an existing world to bump up against to update your world model, right? So whatever is resisting you just assimilating everything to yourself is that world, and it needs to be mapped in a better or worse kind of way, in a better kind of way if something's going to adapt and thrive. And so that's the existential challenge. So yeah, I think that there's a way of holding a perspectival aspect without it dissolving into sort of radical relativism. And I'm very skeptical, I mean, to put it mildly, of anyone who thinks that, oh yes, there is a fully knowable, potentially pre-given world of a particular kind out there that we can just map. That's not the way that it works. So yeah, in a way, this gets to aspects of meta-modern thought. If you sort of radicalize the postmodern insight of perspectivalism, you actually get a new sort of absolute, which is there's the absolute aspect of the perspectival nature of relationship. I don't want to get too kind of philosophical down that road, but I would just echo all of that. I also would throw in that I would consider myself a process thinker, very influenced by process thought and the kind of Whiteheadian tradition and process philosophy. So I think that in terms of an ontology, and actually Clement, I think, talks about this in his own work around framing the ontology of a cosmological perspective as well, of foregrounding processes rather than substances and all of that. I think that if you get a sufficient level of complexity to map a sufficiently understood complex world, you're going to see that the boundaries are always fuzzy, that everything winds up being profoundly relational. I could go on and on, but I guess I'm just saying, yeah, I think what you're getting at is really important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Julian, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I will unmute myself. Yeah, I love this. I love your stuff. I love your approach. I agree with you on a huge amount of it. I've got two questions, and they're kind of almost the same question at different levels, and they're about how you actually measure all of this, right? Mm-hmm. You're talking about meaning as increasing the viability of the organism in its environment. I would say there's a subtlety to that, and I just wonder, is it capturable in your model? Which is sometimes you learn and complexify in ways that fuck you up rather than make things better for you. I know some really intelligent people who've done an awful lot of thinking and they've used it to ruin their lives. So is there a way, and there's organisms that have gone down in complex paths that have led them to kind of evolutionary dead ends.
Yeah.
They've got more complex, but they've also cut themselves up. I'm just wondering, is there a way of differentiating between meaningful complexification that makes you more viable in your environment, and meaningful complexification that destroys you and your environment?
Yes, great question. Really important too. And actually, it's sort of in the question itself, because, all right, so the basic way I would say is that this is complexity is not inherently meaningful, I would say, right?
Yeah.
But it's a necessary, but let's say not sufficient aspect for what is meaningful and more meaningful, right? So I'd put it this way, that more complexity doesn't necessarily mean more meaning, but more complex meaning is going to be more evolutionarily adaptive. So that, which is to say, like, yeah, I could develop a really complex understanding of, an intricate Byzantine kind of, model of the world. And if it doesn't actually map to anything, then it's really complex, but it's not helpful. Similarly, though, I could have a really simple one, but that's also not very helpful because it's not taking in as much information to be, the more I could understand and map in a helpful way for me, that would be better. So you actually want to have is both of them together, right? You want to have the you want to be cued into as many variables as possible, in a sense, which requires more information processing, and so that's greater complexity, but in a way that is genuinely adaptive, right? And so so maybe there's a kind of tautology in there, and I could maybe do some work to try to formalize this a little better, but it is to say that it's like, yeah, it's not just more complexity equals more meaning. It's more complex meaning is better than less complex meaning. That's the normativity aspect to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think you're right. To the extent that it maps onto reality accurately, it's going to usually be better.
Yeah.
So that's a good, that's a good element of it. And the other thing was a linguistic version of that question. In some ways, the lexical,
Lectical, yeah.
The lexical model,
Mm-hmm.
it seems to sort of what would you say, preference in a way, kind of abstraction and size of ideas, how much they, and I think that is a form of complexification that's in many ways good. But I think there's a point which I see in papers that I read where all the language is complex and abstract, and they've lost a whole layer of meaning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And actually the information content and how it maps onto the world has actually collapsed.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, would such a paper rate highly in your analysis, or is there a mechanism to discount papers that have gone so abstract they've disconnected from reality in ways that are actually going to make them kind of useless? Because there's a kind of a sort of reductionist materialism, abstraction omega point that I think is no longer connected to reality and actually isn't good in the terms that you're trying to analyze. I'm just wondering, how do you measure that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I would say, I mean, there's I obviously don't mean to be reductive either in this. So measures can give us some things, but they're not telling the whole story. So I do think there continues to be a hermeneutic aspect for this. And I think a complexity measure tells you some information, but it doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't tell you necessarily how meaningful that complex statement is, right? And so I could say a couple of things. One would be, yeah, that we need to add in additional kind of factors into our consideration. That it's not just, okay, we'll take this number to stand in for this kind of level of meaning. I think it is telling us something significant, probably to some degree, right? If someone is throwing around terms like cyclic and iterative and recursive and these kinds of things, and provided it's not gobbledygook, it's not just a bunch of words on the page, but that these actually have a coherent logic to what they're trying to communicate, then that seems to be reflective of a cognitive complexity that's being captured in some way. But again, that hermeneutic move of whether or not it's gobbledygook or not is important, right? So I think you have to frame, like, what is this? What is the actual message here? What's it getting at? You have to actually do the exegetical work of unpacking the ideas and then actually assessing them. And so I guess I'm just going to keep coming back to the same point, which is that I don't think that this analysis alone can give you whether it's sufficient or necessary or sufficient or whatever. It's like there's an additional hermeneutical step there. in scoring some of this postmodern literature, I disagree with these fellows, right? Like Richard Rorty, I think he's wrong. He's like, but it's not just, his work.
He's right about some things, wrong about some things. Yeah, there's areas where he's strong, and there's areas.
Sure. But I mean, I specifically scored some things where he's basically getting at this thing of like, well, it's not really about truth, because what is truth, and there's none of that. But at least we can have interesting conversations that, and all this sort of stuff. So I was very interested in trying to score texts that that captured a kind of radical constructed relativism versus more, potentially multi-systematic kind of ideas. And the jury's still out a little bit. I would say the data is inconclusive to some degree of whether or not you can tell meaningful distinctions in ideological differences of philosophy using this method. More on that to come. But I guess it's just to say that like a text like that will score at 1140 or 1150, and that's pretty high, right? But that doesn't make him right. It just means that he's a really smart dude, but he's maybe wrong about some things, as I would say. But,
again, it goes back to the problem: does it map onto reality? And if it's drifted clear of reality, then it's actually unhelpful, but high-ranking in the. It's very hard. It's a tricky one to measure. It's a very tricky one to measure. And I think also there's a kind of a curve to language that's kind of interesting, where there's a point where language starts to get simpler again. And you can find and the person who can express the extremely complex abstract thought in simple language is actually superior to the person who has to use the big abstract terms. And I think there are sayings of the Buddha that are way more grounded in reality, complex and rich than a postmodern paper on some highly abstruse thing, which would rate well. In the lexical realm, but and how the hell do you measure that? It's very tricky.
No, there's a lot to that, and a couple things. One is on that front, right? Like, I would say, all right. Point one is some electrical scoring is accounting for that. Like, it's not just looking at you add more big words and it gets a better score. It very often the opposite in some interesting ways. So it really is identifying structural aspects that are communicating big ideas, but can do it in relatively simple language sometimes. So that is part of, and why I think it's a valuable metric that's different from other ways of trying to look at sort of linguistic complexity. So that's point number one. Point number two is, yes, totally agree. For example, a postmodern text versus, like, say, the parables of Christ, right? It's like, that's going to be a story, and it's probably going to show up somewhere around, I don't know, like 1020, or maybe even in the late 900s. So, because it's basically just representations. A guy did this, but it's implicit what's significant about it, right? Now, what's interesting about that is, yes, if you actually just scored that, it's going to score low. But the interpretation of what's going on there, you could write that out, and then you could score that, and that might actually be more revealing in some ways, right? But at the same time, it's not the actual text itself, it's the interpretation of the text. So then you're in another layer of hermeneutic kind of question. But there's an interesting thing there.
I probably think about this a lot because I write children's books, and I will write a children's book, and I think, what am I dealing with in this children's book? I want to explain to 5-year-olds the problem of fascism. I've written children's books where you're using compassion and empathy to solve your problems, and now I want to write a book where compassion and empathy will not solve your problems, but I want to do it for 5-year-olds in a way that won't freak them out. But that's the core argument. And by the time you finish with it, it's not gonna hit a lot of high abstraction buttons, but it is hopefully going to get across something. And how do you tell that apart from a different picture book or a children's book or whatever?
Okay, we have a few more questions. So Charles, please go ahead.
Great questions. I appreciate it. Thanks, Julian.
Well, thank you, Brendan. Really fascinating. And I'm going to also continue riffing on Julian's ideas in two directions. The first one is this issue of a diminishing returns curve versus the acceleration curve of energy consumption. These two don't seem to jive, at least visually. I don't know if meaning-wise they jive, but I'd love to have your thoughts on that. And second, I'm constantly, partially related to what Julian was saying, I'm also always concerned about an end curve of not just diminishing returns, but negative returns past a point of dynamic equilibrium. And so I'm thinking of complexity versus brittleness in a sense. Have you also looked at the brittleness of societies where complexity goes beyond a certain point? imagine for a second if we had the solar flare wiping up all our microprocessors.
Yeah.
Thrown back 100 years, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The energy aspect of this is still really early going. We haven't really done any kind of quantitative assessment. That was more sort of a teaser of like, I think there's something here. The relationship isn't one-to-one. It's not like, oh, when you exponentially increase energy input, you exponentially increase complexity. But there might be a relationship, and it might be a particular, there might be a kind of ratio that could be found there, and I don't know exactly what that looks like. But we would need we need to finish the scoring of the texts, of the historical texts, and then we would have to try to map that specifically to these energy values at these same points in history, and then do that analysis. So that's kind of remains to be done. But yeah, just to say that it's not a direct mapping. But I do think that there's my overall thesis, which I feel pretty confident about, is that social complexification is deeply enmeshed with sort of mimetic complexification, if that makes sense. In the same way, these studies, you get into like the what do they call it, cliodynamic stuff, and the different look, these moments in which societies reconfigure their social kind of whether it's modes of production or these kinds of big transformations at the systems level, tend to work in some ways, and we don't know the direct causal link here in some of these interesting ways. It could be that the modes of production thing happens first, and then ideas come later, or maybe it's the opposite. But you get these structural shifts in different ways of thinking relative to these different social configurations. So Morris's work speaks to that in some way, in terms of talking about the emphasis on egalitarianism in hunter-gatherer societies. Well, that makes a lot of sense in that particular social configuration. If you want to up the energy kind of consumption in a way, you're going to then need to break into agraria, basically, and then to do that comes with all sorts of reconfigurations that need to happen to society. That's going to lead to different kinds of values. It's going to become more hierarchical, less egalitarian, and then you start seeing these patterns show up. And then the fact that those patterns are also kind of cross-cultural. Like if you look at the Mayans and you look at the ancient Mesopotamians, it's like very similar structures in terms of like social hierarchies and general kind of social organizational principles. So it's not like a cultural diffusion thing. There seems to be a structural, systemic way that some of these phase transitions happen from different modes of production, and that those are accompanied by conceptual meaning-making phase transitions as well. And that all of that is connected to energy and information processing, essentially, right? So you're going to need a bureaucracy to process all this kind of surplus food, and that's going to require more information processing. It's going to require that you up the cognitive complexity of at least some portion of society to be able to deal with that complexity. So there's all these ways that these things are really fascinatingly correlated, and we're just at the beginning of seeing what those correlations are, what the causal flows are between this and that. Another example is like there's a debate whether, do you get the big gods, this idea, like the move from sort of let's say a polytheism that then actually leads to a more axial style, like big transcendence way of thinking about the divine and the big God. Does that create, in a sense, what becomes the axial age, or does the axial age in its transformations create the big gods? And which way does that flow? So anyway, this might all seem like it's only loosely getting at your question, but I'm just saying that there's a really fascinating thing to be explored here in terms of how specifically energy throughput relates to complexification of meaning structures. And I think there's something there, but we don't have the exact details. And then as for like brittleness and anti-fragility, that's a really interesting thing. No, we haven't really looked at that yet. I'm not sure. We'd have to find scholars who have done that kind of research and see if we could sync up our data with them. One of the next moves for this is to also, once we've finished the scoring of the historical texts, compare that to like the Shishak database, if you're familiar with the Shishak database, which is basically a big database of these social anthropologists looking at complexity metrics, right? So like there's all these different variables, like is there literacy that we can demonstrate at this point, or is there a bureaucracy, or is there a state functionary, blah, 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 blah. And it's a big data set, and it allows you to map to modes in history relative to certain kind of complexity levels. And so we would want to do that first. And then related to that, though, could be some then interesting analyses in terms of like, where were these systems really brittle? Like you look at the Bronze Age collapse, and that was a pretty brittle system eventually for what happened there. I guess a lot of that's just to say, yeah, work to be done. I guess the last thing I'll say about that, though, is that I think you're getting at sort of an additional meta level here, which isn't necessarily going to be found in this data, which is sort of like what's really adaptive, right? So, yeah, everything's going really well until the comet hits, right? And it probably would have been good for us to allocate a lot more resources to trying to deal with those questions rather than these other things. And the fact that we didn't means that we did something pretty maladaptive there. But before the comet hits, everything looks really complex and sunny and bright. And so there are all these ways in which you can stand a bit further outside the frame, and then you can reassess what is actually adaptive. But yeah, I don't think that that's necessarily going to show up in the kinds of complexity metrics we're using to study this stuff. Anyway, so just some initial thoughts, but it's a really great question, and trying to also just find metrics for anti-fragility is an interesting thought, and I'm sure there's literature out there about that, but I'm not too much.
Okay, thanks. Jeff, your turn.
Brendan, thank you very much for your work, and it's great to know that we're not alone. There's such an overlap. Also, you opened my eyes to meta-modernism. I had always thought it was like postmodernism, but worse, or more, I should say. And so I've been ignoring it for the last few years. And my wife said, and now I'm reading about it and telling my wife, and she's going, I think you found your tribe.
Yeah, that's a common experience.
So thank you very much. My question for you has to do with, I'm reading your book, Emergence, and you mentioned the omega point, and there's the Teilhard version, the Tipler version, and I thought, oh no, not a static point, but you said it's always receding. And so I'm a little bit lost as to what you really mean. How can it be a point if it's receding? I heard you say that you're process oriented in your thinking, which so am I, and so it's more about the process than a goal of perfection, right? And so can you please explain to me how you can have a point, but it's always receding?
Sure. Yeah, just a little context here. So yeah, I wrote a book called Emergentism, a religion of complexity for the metamodern world. And that was a distillation of a lot of the stuff I was reading. And I wanted to present a very big picture, also very popular and accessible, and more kind of like, what's the big takeaway from all this? So that one is certainly more sort of, it's aimed at a different kind of audience. It's but it moves into more speculative registers. And as the name suggests, it's kind of trying to engage these things as its own kind of meaning system that could be, its own kind of worldview. But anyway, as for that question, yeah, my envisioning there, and again, sorry if I lose anyone with this, we're kind of moving into a slightly different register here, but there is a kind of concept of, one way of thinking about it would be that the point is a symbol. It represents the kind of mystery that we move into. And as we move into it, things get disclosed out of that, and so that mystery becomes known. And this is one way of thinking about all the other things that we have been talking about in this conversation in terms of learning and all the things that go into cognition and predictive processing. But there's basically a step into the unknown. But as you learn more about it, that it becomes disclosed and known, but then there's still something outside of the known. And so you move into that. And so then ideally that becomes more. And so it's an iterative process in which knowledge increases. But I guess actually to the earlier question, right, the full totality of it all is not ever going to be known, right? So it's a distinct difference from like a Hegelian notion of like the absolute or absolute knowledge. It's not like, now there it all is. It's like the totality is itself structured by a receding incompleteness. Like if you want to think about the logic of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right? Like that is somehow the metaphysical ontological logic of the ultimate, right? So it's not like, the ultimate, there it is. It's like the ultimate is inherently or intrinsically, frame breaking. So I use, that symbol and that idea to gesture to that. But it is operating in like a mythopoetic register. So, there's going to be ways in which it's not capturing the fullness of that thought. But yeah.
Thanks for the context. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, next question is myself. I have my hand up. So I'm wondering if in your historical analysis of the lexical index, if you had any outliers from really the major intellectual figures, or like Aristotle, is he clearly higher than the others, or some other important figures? So are there any outliers in the historical data?
Well, yeah, so again, we've done hunter-gatherer, archaic, postmodern, and sort of, meta-modern or integrative. So we haven't, unfortunately, done the Aristotle and some of the axial age thinkers yet, or some of the modern ones. In terms of outliers, though, actually one of the most interesting outliers to me was it's like the earliest historical datum that we have, which is the Wisdom of Pahotep. So this is like a document from around 2300 BCE, I think. It's ancient Egyptian. And it's basically, kind of like wisdom literature, if you're familiar with that kind of thing, like in, the books of wisdom and the whole kind of wisdom literature tradition and the biblical tradition and that sort of thing. Various religions have had wisdom literature lineages. But anyway, it has sort of life advice and sagacious kind of insight, and that's scored at 1080. Now that's really interesting because that's like fully competent formal operations, and once you think about it, it's not that surprising because you're like, oh, okay, yeah, well, upper class elite Egyptian scribe, trusted confidant of the pharaoh.
Mhm.
Yeah, he's probably had some really intense mentor or tutorship and education experience, and there's a small group of folks that are very engaged in intellectual pursuit and these kinds of things. So so when you compare that to like the average ancient Egyptian peasant, like that's way higher than what would be the norm there. But just to see that highest score so early was really interesting. So that was one outlier. Maybe the highest outliers come from, this is an interesting distinction. So we scored the postmodern texts, and some were postmodern philosophers, and some were people talking about postmodernism. And there was actually a difference between those scores. And I had to tease that apart when I saw them come in. So like if you actually look at the Foucault and the Rorty and the Kuhn and stuff, that's like around 1150, 1170. But then people like Frederick Jameson and Linda Hutchin and Ihab Hassan, postmodern theorists, people theorizing about postmodernism, were actually like 1200, 1209, 1208. And so there was actually a distinction there to be made. Well, it's like, well, yeah, one group is doing postmodern philosophy, the other's doing sort of postmodern anthropology or like cultural theory. And to do cultural theory, you have to take into consideration, literary studies and economics and a whole bunch of different fields to actually think about what are the common principles that are undergirding this whole thing. And so it makes sense that that's a more complex, and complexly integrated sort of level of analysis. So that was interesting. But yeah, we'll have to do more scoring to see other kinds of,
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense from a developmental perspective that the scholars who are able to analyze postmodern thoughts have to be outside to have it as an object.
Exactly, yeah.
Have to be in a higher level of cognition to see it as an object.
Yeah.
So maybe Bob hasn't spoken yet. So Bob, go ahead, please. You can unmute yourself. Yes, you are unmuted.
Is that for me, Clement? Yes, I would just a bit of a defense of the postmodern. You got, first of all, your talk is at such a high level, full of so much detail and great study of all of these thoughts of the past. So I'm just going to give you a very simple thing and maybe relate to your meta-modern. My simple-minded view is that the pre-modern, which I call traditional, and it's called traditional because traduire is to hand down. So the knowledge we got handed down by 2,000, 3,000 years ago, came to us and was accepted because it was what our elders told us. It's what our parents told us as children. Now, the modern age and the Renaissance and all of that time of physics development with Galileo and Copernicus and Newton seem to think that the ultimate knowledge will be coming from reason alone. That God had given us a mind and we were given a gift of being reasoning people, and we could reason to the truth of absolutely everything. Now, I would just like to jump to say the time you mentioned. I would think it starts with Nietzsche and Heidegger, because the beginning of existentialist thought, the idea that basically many ideas in our world of thinking about things have been invented by people with new ideas, and that postmodern is fundamentally a statement that there are many things that we cannot reason to. And so that's my triplicity of pre-modern is tradition, it's handed down. The middle age of modern is to be able to reason to everything, but frankly, we cannot reason to everything, and we have to have what we call postmodern. Now, that's a defense of postmodern, because a lot of the things that we have invented, we've created, we've thought up, we brought into the world of knowledge that we've learned about, as you say, in the universal learning, are things that we brought to the world, to the universe, okay? And now you could connect that to metamodern, but I just have a very simple view of those first three. Thank you. And
No,
good
that's
talk. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm glad you said that, and I think that's actually really important. And to be clear, yeah, the meta-modern by nature is something that tries to integrate those genuine insights of the postmodern, right? So, so something that's coming online now after the postmodern is, I think, only genuinely meta-modern if it's able to build off of those key insights. So. Yeah, if you want to think about that move from the modern to the postmodern, you get this sort of, you know, and these are obviously always to some degree heuristics, stereotypes, you know, caricatures, right? But there's something in the modern that's a kind of triumphalist, you know, Enlightenment progress narrative. We'll learn it all, we'll know it all, then we'll
Right.
you know, we'll finish the story, right? And then the postmodern answer to that is no, you won't. Like, it doesn't work that way. And that's a real insight, and it's based on that insight that you get things like complexity and chaos and these deeper patterns in the irreducible and in the unknowable and in all these things. So it's a core insight, and I think that that's a really important treasure of the legacy of postmodernism. What we tend to talk about as postmodern, though, tends to get elided with a kind of radical version of that, which is we can't know anything and we can't communicate to anyone. Right. And so that leads to a kind of skepticism and a relativism, and ultimately, I think, a kind of nihilism. So postmodernism often gets kind of a bad rap because a lot of people took things in that kind of direction. But the metamodern is sort of like, okay, that part of it, not so much. But that insight around the fundamental unknowability of certain things, et cetera, that we carry forward. And so, yeah, the metamodern is trying to look at the traditional, the modern, and the postmodern and try to integrate the best of the key insights there without having the hangups and the problems and the impasses of those different systems as well. So it's been an effort that people in integrative and integral communities have been interested in now for the past 30 years or so. But that's sort of the statement, is like these different epochs and the wisdoms that they hand to us, there's gems of insight in each of them. And it's not to say that, oh, as one surpasses the other, we can just discard it. It's like we're building on the knowledge across these different traditions. And today, traditional wisdom is important, and modern insight is important, and postmodern critique is important. So they stack on top of each other. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed your
thank
talk.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll have to wrap up. It's time. So if you still have questions and you're part of the Evo-Devo universe community, feel free to ask more questions on our mailing list. And if you're external to the community, you may apply to join our discussion list. We have about 100 scholars. The only requirement is that you have published about the Evo-Devo topics. Thank you again very warmly, Brendan. It was a fantastic hour and a half, very rich. Yeah, I will also send you more questions.
Great.
And I wish you all a great
Yeah,
What's your
thank you.
name?
I just want to say real quick, this was delightful. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Really looking forward to engaging with this community more, and I'm really excited. And yes, it was mentioned early on, we did also just launch this journal integration. So I think this community should keep that journal in mind for if you have things that you'd like to publish and to get involved with the Institute in whatever way if you're interested in the things that we're up to. But I really look forward to keep the conversation going, and thanks so much for this opportunity to share with you guys. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
That was wonderful.
Good
And thank
to
you,
see
everybody else.
everybody.
Great conversation. Really
Awesome.
enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody.
Take care,
Thanks,
guys.
Absolutely
Bye-bye.
fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, really good.